So I'm going to say a few words about how we look at tax design. And I thought that as this is the TARC conference, I should look at administration. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that we have everything the wrong way around. Our custom is to see things in a clear order. First of all, we look at the economic principles behind taxation. Then we look at the how that fits with the underlying substantive law. And only then do we think about administration and how we administer taxes. But in the work I've been doing recently, particularly on taxing the gig economy, I think that we have got that all the wrong way about, and I'm going to try to demonstrate that now. I think we should sometimes be starting with administration and starting with what is practical and what will work. And that will lead us to what is fair and what is going to fit with our objectives. Had you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said that that's completely the wrong way around. But this, perhaps the influence of working with the Office of Tax Simplification, although I'm not speaking for them at all, and perhaps just general weariness with trying to design new tax systems from economic principles and finding that we never get very far. Perhaps we do have to just think about this slightly differently in order to make some progress. Technological changes mean that there may be new possibilities to take things in different directions. And again, instead of starting with what we've got now and seeing how the new technology might fit onto that, perhaps what we need to do is start with the new technology and look first at the opportunities that it gives us, and then see how we can shape our law to fit in with that. Our new ways of taxing may not fit in with existing conceptions. After all, we used to tax windows. We have to be prepared to change. Our tax systems at an international level are clearly in a mess. The same is true about many at a domestic level. And I think that we do have to find some new ways forward. So more and more frequently, taxation does not seem fit for the purpose in the modern world. Because relationships and possibilities and business models are changing. Digitalization is an obvious example, and the usual concern here is mobility of capital and the difficulty of locating where profits are actually made and where they should be taxed. And we think about residence and source, and we try to adapt those concepts and modify those concepts to meet the changing circumstances. It's very difficult to say where the location is of certain types of business now. So we try to make up some new rules about permanent establishments so that they are more encompassing of the new technology. But perhaps that's not the way to do it. If our existing legal concepts do not reflect the way the world works, it's not surprising that the tax system based on those concepts is out of step, and we shouldn't hesitate to change it. At both an international and domestic level, the new technology gives us new options. And this is nowhere clearer than in the employment model, where case law and legislation based on principles and agents and masters and servants just doesn't fit the modern world. So at an international level, in the BEPS process, instead of radically changing our approach to taxation and looking at destination-based taxes or formulary apportionment, we are clinging on to the arm's length principle and tweaking around the edges. At a domestic level, where we have a distinction between employees and the self-employed, we are clinging on to that distinction, even though we have perhaps gone past its sell-by date. And my argument is that we should abandon some of these concepts and move forward. Are they even as fundamental as we think they are? We have become used to the idea that residence and source, employee and self-employed are really fundamental, but I know people have done work on international tax which has shown that not to be the case. It's all arisen in some as a result of certain decisions made, sometimes quite coincidentally. And I want to show how this is also not the case with the employed, self-employed dichotomy. So my argument is that in designing taxes, we should think administration first. Now, this is some people's idea of administration. This is Charles Dickens' Office for Circumlocution. You know, when we think of administration, we think sometimes of bureaucracy, but they are not the same thing. Administration does not equal bureaucracy. We need to think about how we are collecting taxes, because if we can't collect taxes, then there's no point in having an ideal tax system. And when we think of Adam Smith's canons of taxation, actually 2 of the 4 canons, and maybe even 3, are really about administration. As he explains, a tax that costs taxpayers a great deal but raises little revenue due to collection costs will not command support from any quarter. So there is really no point in having it. And we can see that in the current discussions around a wealth tax, for example. The first objections that always come up to a wealth tax are that it will cost more to collect than it will raise. And this is, again, coming up in the current discussions around wealth taxes. It can be a killer point. So, valuation is going to be costly. There's no point. You start from a principle that you want to tax wealth. You see how assets are defined, and then you look at the costs. That soon but if we can transform that into what assets can we define easily? What assets can we value easily? And then can we define our tax base against what we can value easily? We may very well be able to come up with a better wealth tax. So we need to start with the administrative considerations. Economic principle might be against having a narrower tax base for wealth, but because it will be fairer to have a wider base. But that may have to be subordinated to the practical considerations, and that in turn modifies the nature of the tax and what can be done with it. So we could just see this as saying we have to recognize practicalities in our design process and make compromises, but I think I'm saying something more fundamental than that. I'm saying that the point is that not only do compromises need to be made, but that sometimes we should start from what is administratively feasible and work backwards. Always bearing in mind the principles we wish to achieve, but not seeing them through the lens of current preconceptions about the world as defined by conventional economics or law. If the tax is collected more efficiently, then rates can be lower, costs can be spread more evenly, and all this will undoubtedly assist with political acceptance. More than this, new technological solutions may change our thinking about what would be fair. So again, if we go back to the valuation problem, we could use platforms like Zoopla, which values residential properties, to base our tax on. Now that might not give us a precise value, but it might make the tax more acceptable and easier to impose. It will be less precise, and therefore we might want to use bands for taxation rather than the precise values. But all that would affect our tax base, but might give us something that really works a lot better. So moving on from that to my case study on taxing work and employment status and the gig economy. The taxation of work and the problem of distinguishing between employed and self-employed has become a major problem in the UK tax system today, and other countries also experience problems around these definitions. In the UK, the problem is exacerbated because there are relatively large differences in the level of taxation, and particularly of national insurance, social security contributions between the two groups. And this is particularly problematic where an intermediary, normally a personal service company, is interposed between the end user of the services and the individual supplier of services. And this disrupts the conventional legal analysis of employer and self-employed. Equally problematic in tax terms is the interposition of a platform such as Uber, for example, or Airbnb between the supplier of services, the driver, and the user of the car service. This creates an arrangement where there is an argument over whether the platform is an employer, an agent, or merely a contact mechanism. And the OECD has recognized this problem in a recent paper, and the EU has a similar paper, and now the UK has a paper on VAT and the problem of platforms. And the OTS has done work on this as well. And once again, the problem is exacerbated in the UK as a result of our domestic tax rules, because we have a very high VAT threshold of £85,000. So we're in a mess. And there's a simpler way to do this. And what we want to do, as I said, is start from the administration and work backwards. That would enable us to change the tax law without distorting other areas of law. I think the government has recognized this in its recent paper on VAT and platforms, which came out actually this month, and actually fitted perfectly with my idea, so I was very pleased to read it. This paper asks whether we should move away completely from the principal-agent dichotomy in contract law, because it is really impossible to change it. Contract law has to serve so many different areas, and develop new criteria for how we tax platforms. Move away from asking whether the Uber driver is an employee or an agent or a principal, but just say we're going to tax the platforms in certain circumstances, and then draw up those circumstances around what will actually work given modern business models. That makes perfect sense to me, although they are consulting on it, they haven't decided on it, and seems a much better way forward than trying to modify the principles of contract law. There will be objections. People will say contract law is long established and the tax law has to fit in with other analyses for other purposes, including employment law, and this is going to complicate matters to have two different sets of law. But actually it doesn't complicate matters. It makes it much easier to solve the tax problem, and then the other problems can be solved as they need to be solved. The important thing for tax is that we collect the tax in such a way that provides a level playing field, horizontal equity, with those providing similar services in other ways, and that the decision on how to operate the business is not dictated by tax considerations, but is based on commercial decisions. So the VAT paper has the potential to be a good story, though we'll have to see how it works out, because I'm sure there will be a lot of lobbying around it. But if the criteria get too complex, then it may give scope for creative compliance. So they need to keep it simple. But at least it will be escaping the shadow of agent and principal law. In the area that I've written a lot about on whether people are employed or self-employed, we do not have a good story. So the story around IR35 and off-payroll taxation. We have a very poor story here. One problem is the spectrum of these workers. There are the Deliveroo and Uber drivers at one end, and at the other end, highly specialist IT contractors charging very high fees, accountants, finance specialists, and we're trying to deal with them all in the same way. And our spectrum must also encompass nurses and supply teachers who are working through an agency, and the skilled tiler or bricklayer on the construction site. And we're trying to come up with a solution for them all. Now, these are not new problems. There have always been piece workers, but the numbers have increased significantly in recent years as the platforms have developed. And we have a binary system of taxation, which tries to divide people into employed and self-employed, and yet there is a whole spectrum, a great variety. Greater protection under employment law has played a part because there's an ever greater incentive for engagers not to employ people and to argue that people are something else. Labour law has developed a category of worker to deal with that intermediate category, but this does not apply for tax purposes. So we have a divergence, which is very confusing for people. And we have a proposal from Matthew Taylor that we should try to have that third category for tax as well, and that we should try to align tax and employment law. And I say we should go completely the other way. Employment law has a lot of problems to be dealt with, and it needs to deal with them the way it needs to deal with them. In tax, our problem is just to tax efficiently, to collect the tax, to reduce evasion, to assist with compliance and make sure everybody pays an equivalent amount of tax, as would be fair. At the moment, we have IR35, which tries to pretend that people are employees when they're not really employees, deems them to be employees. It uses very complicated case law, which is extremely difficult to apply, and which is causing great confusion and uncertainty in the tax system. And now this responsibility for doing this is going to be transferred to employers, and they are going to have to deduct at source. And basically the aim is to bring everyone into the PAYE system. We just had a session on COVID and tax, and we do know that the excluded, many of those who are excluded from the UK COVID special provisions to help the support people have been excluded because they were not within the PAYE system. So the Chancellor's very keen, I think, to get everybody into the PAYE system. And he's doing this in this thoroughly complicated way, not him personally, but the revenue authorities are doing this in this complicated way of trying to use the old case law and deem everybody to be an employee, except that sometimes they're not. So we're going to have an argument all the time about whether somebody is an employee or not. And we don't need to do this. We don't need to put ourselves through this terrible performance. What we need to do is rethink that and just say, let's tax another bigger group of people under PAYE. Don't worry about the employed, self-employed thing. Now, some people will say, but it's fundamental. It's fundamental that these people are employed or self-employed, and we must tax them all in the same way as we treat them for other areas of law. But there's nothing fundamental about that at all. When Addington introduced his Income Tax Act in 1803, most employees were actually taxed under what we then called Schedule D. Most employees were taxed in the same way or a very similar way to those who had a trade or a profession. Only public officials were taxed under Schedule E, and that was because it was possible to deduct at source from public officials because they had the sort of employers who could deduct at source, but everyone else had to pay the tax themselves. And so this was an administrative decision on how to tax people. It was based on what was administratively possible. And that began to change during the World Wars. So in the First World War, more workers came into the tax net, more people were brought into income tax, and by 1922, employees were all put into what we called Schedule E. They all started to be treated in the same way as public employees. But there was still no deduction at source. And interestingly, Daunton, the historian, tells us that it was the unions who were opposed to deduction at source. They didn't want deduction at source. They thought it was an invasion of rights and privacy and their power, I suspect. So unsatisfactory ways were found to spread payments, but people got into a mess because they were having to make their payments every 6 months. And that was very hard if you were a weekly paid wage labourer. So by the time even more people were brought into the income tax net during the Second World War, in 1943, finally, the UK introduced payment, a deduction at source for everyone under what we now know to be the PAYE system, the pay-as-you-earn system. So this was a very clever, cumulative deduction at source system and has served us very well. So again, it was the administration that the necessities of administration that forced us into change, and also the world wars. So perhaps this next crisis, the COVID crisis, will force the next change. PAYE has led to some substantive, important substantive points about the way we tax employees. In particular, very narrow rules on the deduction of expenses, because if the employer is going to deduct tax at source and the basis is cumulative, you're trying to get it right every month, you want to have as few individually based factors as possible. So employee expenses tend to be dealt with by blanket allowances rather than being available individually. But now we have a situation where we need to bring more people into this deduction at source mechanism, whether they're working via a platform, through an intermediary, through an agency, or a personal service company. And in my view, we should do this by just moving them all into a new category and saying, we're just going to tax them at source. It doesn't matter whether they're employees or whatever they are. And we can do this because we have the technology to do it now. They can all have personal service accounts. The third parties who are paying them, whether they be employers or platforms or whatever, can provide the information to the revenue through the personal service account. It can be used to pre-fill a tax return, which can be filled and payments can be made every month or every 3 months. It's really much simpler now that we have the technology. Now we have the digitalization of the tax system, or we would have if our system was up to it. At the moment, the UK system isn't up to it, but one would hope that in 10 years' time it would be. Now that could spell the death of cumulative PAYE, of which we've all been so proud, but it can die because we don't need it anymore, because we have other ways of achieving the same objective. It would mean that everybody would have to engage with the Revenue Authority, but it would be much simpler because they could do it through technology. And this might be a positive thing because people at the moment have very little understanding of how much tax they're paying. And it might be better for democracy if they knew a bit more about what they were paying and had to focus on it. And we've seen in countries like Russia, Estonia, and so on, that technologically this could be done. And this might end up changing our substantive rules. It might make it much easier, in fact, it should make it much easier to align the treatment of different types of worker, reduce anomalies between them, and reduce distortions in the tax system, which are encouraging engagers to use the self-employed rather than employees at the moment. In the early 20th century, people could not conceive of a system where ordinary employees had tax deducted at source, but it happened, and it has served us very well, allowing most UK citizens to pay more or less the right amount of tax with minimal effort on their part and much increasing compliance. Now, people can't conceive of a world where we don't do that, where everybody has tax deducted at source. Instead, not in a cumulative way, but where we all operate the same system, whether we're employed or self-employed. But in my view, that will and should be the norm. And this could happen if we were sensible, and we could stop arguing about all the detailed case law that is bogging us down at the moment. If we could only lift our eyes and think about administration rather than that detail. And this would cut evasion, reduce complexity, and actually prevent people from being led astray into really complicated and nasty tax avoidance schemes by various unscrupulous promoters. So this is how, in my view, administrative feasibility can shape how we design our taxes and impact on the substance of our tax system, and why we should start and not end with administration. And I've just got a slide with a few references here to some of the things I've been using, some of the work I've been using, and a reference to a new note I've got out in the British Tax Review issue 4, which doesn't actually talk about this, but which was why I started thinking about this as I was working through the new provisions in the Finance Act 2020, which are absolutely horrible. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you for a fascinating lecture. There's a thought in the chat box, okay, from Stephen. It's more of a thought. It's not a question, and he completely agrees with what you say. If you want to read through, while I'm opening the floor, okay, for discussion.
That's on there. Well, yeah.
Any thoughts from from the audience? Any?
It's very late. Everybody's
It is a bit late, but for me, again, I'm an economist, and I mean, you mentioned a few times the the role of digitalization and the so the question I have is how much how much do we need to rely on that? I guess one can think a situation which is going to be a limiting case where we digitalize everything and everything is known, and therefore, I mean, there's no inefficiency losses. And in terms of equity, we can achieve that because we know everything. So if we know everything, we can fix any margin in terms of distortions in the economy. Is it something that you think is feasible? Is it something that you welcome? What's your thought on that?
Well, there are clearly privacy issues which worry people, just as they did in Addington's time, which is why he had the scheduler system, and no one office knew the total of what somebody earned. I think we probably need to find ways of protecting people's, well, we definitely need to protect people's privacy, and we have to have very strong rules about privacy and HMRC's use of the information. But I think most people probably believe HMRC knows most of their business anyway in the end. So I think most people would be prepared to trade off the privacy, a certain loss of privacy, with the ease of being able to have all their information collated for them. I mean, anyone on PAYE, the revenue has all your information anyway, and the vast majority of people in the UK are on PAYE. So we're not talking about very many people actually as a percentage of the population who would be giving more information to HMRC.
There's a question from Lotta.
It's also about I think it is a democratic right to have a tax system that you understand, and that it's also important for trust and morale so that it can function, because we know that if people don't trust and don't understand the tax they're paying, that they will be less willing to pay it. So it's very fundamentally linked with democracy. And I think that many people in the UK and people outside the UK may not realize quite how much this works, how this happens. But we have, if we're only receiving employment income, we engage not at all with our revenue authority. All we do is receive our pay slips, and that shows how much has been deducted. And we have very little explanation of why it's being deducted or whether it's even right. And our system's so complicated that it can be quite hard to work out whether it's right. And I think that does make people feel very detached from the tax-paying process. And that does seem to me to be a democratic problem, a problem with our democracy and how involved we feel in the tax design and collection process.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Do I think tax policy and administration are two separate functions and therefore cannot? No, I think actually, I think my argument is that you can't distinguish tax policy setting and administration. And I've been involved in the Tax Law Research Committee of the IFS was set up to look at administration rather than policy. And I argued right from the beginning that that just couldn't be done because you cannot distinguish the two. The very first job I was given was to look at the problem of the employed and self-employed and why they were taxed differently. And I said, yes, that is partly administrative, but we also have to look at policy. They are totally interlinked. And I think the Office of Tax Simplification really, and I'm not speaking with my board hat on here, but I do think they have found the same thing. Increasingly, the Office of Tax Simplification papers are getting into policy because you can't really improve the administration without thinking about the policy and vice versa. And Kevin says, would you agree that administration and what is practicable should also apply to the formulation of tax policy-based incentives? Absolutely. Yes, and you have to think about, in that case, what is practical, but you also then have to think about the economic policy of whether you want tax policy-based incentives and what you're going to achieve by it and what the unforeseen consequences might be. Mm-hmm. So all of those things. So I'm not saying you shouldn't think about all the things we normally think about, but yes, you have to think about the administration, and R&D in particular in the UK got very bogged down in some complexities which meant that some people were not claiming. And so then you're not achieving your policy aim if it's too complicated for the people you want to claim. So then you had to simplify it.
There are a couple of questions from Dirk. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I find it very refreshing to hear a law academic call for designing the tax law from scratch. And then he goes on, instead of reforming in detail, my question is, what consequences does your proposal have for the social security system and contributions?
Well, I wish there was an Office of Social Security simplification as well. I mean, it is actually, I don't think universal credit is, I think the administrative possibilities for universal credit are actually quite good. I think it is an improvement on the old benefit system. So there, I think the administration is quite good, but what might have gone wrong is some of the policy behind it and some of the and the amount of money being put into it. I think if you were putting more money into the social security system, and this is again just my personal view, that it could work reasonably well, but you do have an underlying policy that you're trying to use the social security system to get people back into work, and that while you have that, then it's always going to be a system that is only fairly minimal and is only going to allow people to live a fairly basic sort of life, and that is a political decision. I mean, that you can't do anything about that with administration. That is a pure policy decision.
Ian Campbell completely agrees with you. As a tax professional here at HMRC, this is very welcome. We will simplify tax design, also its collection and compliance. One issue is degree of digital confidence by taxpayers.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the excluded and those who can't use digital systems. And of course, for older people, that's a problem. And there are people in this country who can't even get broadband because we have such poor rollout in rural areas. But I really think these are problems that will not last beyond 5 years. I mean, we've seen, and that is actually relevant to a question you asked earlier in the day, Christus, we've seen that we all have to be able to use digital systems. We've had to learn, if we didn't know before, during the pandemic. My grandchildren are all pretty proficient at Zooming me and also taking over the Zoom so that they don't have to listen to me if they don't want to anymore. So, I think children now completely familiar with digitalization. It's like a it's pens and paper they don't understand. So these are really quite short-term problems, and I think soon we have to make sure that the capacity is there for everybody to be able to use digital systems, but I think that should happen soon. And we should design for the future, not design for what might be the transitional problems.
Andy has a thought about platforms.
Yeah, it's a good question. It is, I was quite glib about that, but clearly the privacy issue is a really serious one, and there would have to be trust there would have to be regulation, really hard regulation. But they already have so much of our information, so in a way, when people get upset about this, I feel that the horse has bolted, and what we need to do is regulate it.
But they're not. So sometimes most of the times they are not willing to give the information to the government, to provide information to the government.
No, and that's why the OECD has got to work on this, and the OECD and the EU have both produced papers on how platforms will have to share across border, because just the UK government would have trouble enforcing this.
Of course. Jim reminds us that tax administration is tax policy.
Yeah, terrific. It would be good to know who did say that. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I think it also appears in the book of John Slemrod, Tax Systems, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
Then there's another one. Do you think tax expenditure incurred by most governments served the original interest when such expenditure were proposed, or such expenditure actually dictated by political economy and elite capture? This is usually the case, some say, in developing countries where democratic stability is ensured. Any comments?
That's a massive question for this time in the evening. Clearly, something has gone wrong with your political system if it doesn't, and it often does go wrong. And it's not just in developing countries. We have developed countries where I would say that our tax is not being used in the way that we had hoped it would be used, and then you either go through the ballot box to deal with that, or you have to have a coup, depending on how far gone it is. But to the extent that we have a democracy, then the answer lies in the ballot box.
And Ian says something about his 5-year-old granddaughter. Right. Any more thoughts? We've got a couple of minutes left before we finish for the day. No? Thank you. Judith, thank you. It has been a fantastic, inspiring lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.